Later, Republican candidate Donald Trump speaks to an audience at Regent University in Virginia. Duke University professor Christopher Bale is the author of the book Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream. He recently spoke to students at Duke University about some of the factors that were contributing to growing anti-Muslim sentiment in the U.S. This is just under an hour.
Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Omid Safi, the director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center. It's an extraordinary honor and privilege for us to have Professor Chris Bale joining us on a topic that is of interest to so many of us. Professor Bale is an assistant professor of sociology at Duke University. He studies how nonprofit organizations and other political actors create cultural change by analyzing large groups of text from newspapers, television, public opinion surveys, and social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter. His research has been published by Princeton University Press, including this wonderful book that we'll come back to in a second, American Sociological Review, Sociological Theory, Theory and Society, Sociological Methods and Research. He's a well-published scholar. His work has been recognized by awards from the American Sociological Association, the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and the Society for Study of Social Problems. He's been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. His research has also been covered by major media outlets such as NBC News, National Public Radio, and Washington Post, and as of today, C-SPAN. Professor Bale earned his PhD from Harvard University in 2011, and his first monograph, which you see projected on the screen, is Terrified. It's a study of how anti-Muslim fringe organizations became mainstream, and it was published by Princeton in 2014. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Chris Bale.
Thank you, Omid, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the John Hope Franklin Center and to the Duke Islamic Studies Center for hosting me. I'd like to begin my talk today by looking at some recent media headlines. Probably most of you heard Donald Trump comments last month in which he claimed to have observed Muslims in New Jersey celebrating after the September 11th attacks. Despite widespread disbelief of this statement, he doubled down and later called for a ban on all Muslims entering the United States. And his competitors were not too far off his heels. So Ted Cruz, several days later, made pointed comments that implied that most or even all Muslims tacitly condone terrorism. Marco Rubio tried to out-Trump Trump and claimed that we should not only be shutting down certain houses of worship, but any place where Muslims congregate. And Ben Carson actually, before Trump, nabbed one of the biggest fundraising hauls in a single hour in the history of the Republican Party for his disparaging comments about Islam. And I don't think we'll see an end to this anytime soon. So my research question that I set out and that I'll answer for you today is simply, how did this anti-Muslim sentiment become so mainstream? How can a leading candidate for the presidency, the leading candidate for the Republican Party, disparage one of the country's largest religious groups, given that our country has foundational principles surrounding religious liberty and freedom? And you may think there's a few easy answers to this question. Muslims, or people who call themselves Muslims, are implicated in some very terrifying recent events, most recently the San Bernardino attacks. But when we look at the numbers, as my colleague Charlie Kurzman has done, we see quite clearly that we should be much more afraid of a variety of other threats to our well-being than terrorism. or at least that the threat of terrorism, there's no clear-cut evidence that it's increasing on an exponential scale. Maybe it's ISIS, this terrifying, or Daesh, this terrifying new organization that has proven that it can take over large swaths of territory, that has committed horrific acts of terror against US citizens and European citizens, that's proven its capacity to do massive harm in places like Paris. And yet I'm going to show you today that this story really begins years before ISIS was even around. Maybe this is just 9/11, you might ask. Maybe this is simply a story about a kind of butterfly effect. So, most Americans pre-9/11, barely knew any Muslims. So the survey data we have suggests less than 1 in 3 Americans had ever met a Muslim, which is somewhat shocking. And I think probably it's more reasonable to say they didn't knowingly meet a Muslim, because Muslims have been in the United States since the very beginning of our history, as many of you probably know. But nevertheless, an event of the scale of 9/11 surely would provoke some type of backlash. And interestingly, what we see is actually an uptick in positive sentiment towards Muslims, and specifically Muslim Americans, after the 9/11 attacks. We don't see a steady growth, a kind of crescent wave-like growth of anti-Muslim sentiment from 9/11 on. And in fact, if we go back to the immediate aftermath of 9/11, prominent Republicans such as George W. Bush were in fact outwardly going out of their way to say Islam is a religion of peace. We're criticizing various evangelical leaders who had said a variety of disparaging things about Muslims. And this image here is Bush meeting with numerous leaders of Muslim American organizations, among them Nihad Awad down here, the current leader of the Council on American Islamic Relations, an organization which now faces pervasive allegations that it tacitly condones terrorism, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. So if it's not fear of terrorism, if it's not ISIS, and if it's not 9/11, what is it? Well, I'm going to argue today that a small network of anti-Muslim organizations in the wake of the September 11th attacks captivated the media, and specifically through emotional appeals. And though these organizations were once peripheral actors within the broader family of organizations trying to shape public discourse about Islam, they've now raised more than $242 million to mount one of the most significant campaigns to shift American public opinion against Islam. I'll show you how they've exerted considerable influence upon our counterterrorism policy, the recent wave of so-called anti-Sharia laws, and perhaps most disturbingly, how they've even been hired to train our counterterrorism officials. And all of this, of course, occurs in the broader context of the so-called battle for hearts and minds that we currently find ourselves in against groups like Daesh or ISIS. And surely, as I'll show you at the end of my talk, these fringe ideas about these anti-Muslim ideas are avid travelers. They get picked up by international media, where I think they may do their most significant harm by tarnishing the reputation of the United States, which was once a paragon for religious freedom, and making it seem as though the US is in fact anti-Muslim, thereby validating the claim of groups like ISIS or Daesh that the US is fundamentally at war with Islam. So this is the subject of my book that Omid, Dr. Safi mentioned, Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream. Now, historically, social scientists, I'm a cultural sociologist, we've looked at small cases of organizations that exerted profound change on public discourse. So we track down an organization that shapes the way we talk about, say, nuclear energy or any kind of big social problem that we all kind of deal with. And there are a variety of problems with that approach. We'd wind up studying groups that succeed, and we wouldn't learn about groups that fail, and we'd wind up with a distorted picture that uses some circular reasoning to try to understand how groups exert influence on public discourse. But when I was trained, I was learning alongside other social scientists about the new wave of computational social science methods, or for so-called big data. These are the increasingly large amounts of data that are available due to the rise of social media, the internet, the mass digitization of archival and historical records, and so on and so forth. And so in my book, I leverage these new computational methods to try to answer this question. Who gets to speak on behalf of Islam before the American public, and why? And to do this, I collected a massive sample of press releases produced by any organizations trying to shape public discourse about Islam. So these include not only anti-Muslim fringe organizations, but also groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, or various other Muslim Public Affairs Council, and so on and so forth, other kind of advocacy groups, religious organizations, think tanks, and so on and so forth, all non-state and non-profit groups trying to shape public discourse about Islam. I then collected all mentions of these organizations in a large group of media documents. So these include newspapers such as the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Times, designed intentionally to measure the kind of political spectrum of the media from left to right, as well as TV, Fox News, CNN, and CBS News. And the innovation of my work is to use a plagiarism detection algorithm to track the extent to which each press release exerts influence upon these larger documents, this larger public discourse about Islam. And what's neat about these new algorithms is we can not only identify kind of verbatim quotes. So here we have a press release that says bias and hate are un-American. This algorithm will also identify near matches or paraphrased quotes of the press releases. Bias and tolerance are un-American in this case. And they enable a kind of quantitative measure of the amount of influence of each organization upon public discourse about Islam. I also conducted in-depth interviews with the leaders of all of these organizations, or a subsample of these organizations, both those that succeeded in influencing public discourse about Islam, as well as those who had little or no influence on shaping public discourse about Islam. And so let me tell you the story that begins, my book actually begins with a history of Muslim American organizations in the United States and the broader struggle to shape public opinion about Islam before the 9/11 attacks. But today I'm going to focus mostly on the post-9/11 period, because I think it has the most implications for the current type of mainstreaming of fringe ideas about Islam that we're seeing among conservative leaders. It's difficult to forget this image. It's seared into many of our heads, our subconscious. And yet what most of us may forget is that there was an outpouring of sympathy for Muslims after the 9/11 attacks. So the Pew Forum has conducted yearly surveys of American public opinion of Islam, which I'll soon show you, which show that there was, as I mentioned earlier, an increase in positive sentiment towards Muslims after the 9/11 attacks. This on top of dozens and dozens and dozens of statements from all manner of civil society groups arguing that Muslims are in fact a peaceful people who are being victimized by an apocryphal minority among them who are hijacking the religion for political ends. And this is an example of how the plagiarism detection analysis can show us this. So I need to take a few minutes to walk you through this graph. First of all, each of these circles describes an organization, think tank, a religious group, an advocacy group, and so on. And the size of each circle describes how much media influence they had, how many times newspapers or television channels regurgitated their message in their press releases. And you can see some organizations, like the Council on American Islamic Relations that I mentioned earlier, have a lot of influence. But most organizations have no influence, these tiny little dots here. Now the position of these circles in Cartesian space, or XY space, describes the similarity of their messages. So with a group of research assistants, I coded the type of language that each organization uses to describe Muslims. These could be things like a Muslims as victims narrative, or Islam as an inherently dangerous and violent religion narrative. And what we see is that most groups, as I just mentioned, were using a mainstream narrative that was simply that mainstream Muslim organizations or Muslim Americans are a peaceful group who are being victimized by a group of political radicals who have hijacked their religion for political ends. And yet, if we look at who got the most media attention, it's groups like the Middle East Forum or the Center for Security Policy, two relatively obscure organizations at the time, in the wake of 9/11, who are receiving the lion's share of media coverage. Now, these groups were advancing a so-called stealth jihad narrative, which will be another theme I'll talk about throughout the talk. And their narrative was essentially that Muslims, and Muslim Americans in particular, are a fifth column that's secretly plotting to undermine the US Constitution, implement Sharia law, and they hide behind a thin veil of political correctness in so doing. So this is an example of the type of work that, the type of messages that came out. On the left is Daniel Pipes from the Middle East Forum, famously launched a Campus Watch campaign. His idea was that US universities had been infiltrated by terrorist sympathizers or apologists for radical Islam, and that a concerted campaign was needed to out these folks and to prevent the future generation of US leaders from being duped into the idea that Muslims are actually a peaceful group, when in fact he was arguing they are a kind of Trojan horse. Likewise, on the right here, you'll see Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy, one of the people who later became instrumental in the so-called anti-Sharia movement and the various attempts to create laws that would prevent the use of Sharia law in the United States. And he famously accused the White House of being infiltrated by extremists, among them Grover Norquist, who had very weak ties to a hedge fund that funds many of the largest Muslim American organizations in the country. And so why did they get in the media? Why didn't mainstream Muslim organizations get in the media? I argue in my book that it's because of the emotional valence of their message. These were, visceral, fearful, and angry condemnations of Muslims and Muslim Americans in particular that really alerted a public that had very little idea, again, what Islam was, who Muslims were. A majority of Americans had not met a Muslim, and a majority of Americans were unable to identify the Quran as the holy book of Islam or Allah as the deity associated with Islam. And so America's imagination about Islam was very fertile. There was a real opportunity to define what was going on. And as is so often the case for the media, the loudest voice gets most of the attention. Now, the story might have ended there had, like the proverbial boy who cries wolf, in the absence of another major terror attack, we might have seen these type of emotional appeals disappear. And instead, we saw something very different. Though I showed you that these groups represented a minority of all voices talking about Islam, it appeared as if they were a majority. And that is because of the media distortion of this family of organizations. So the majority view wasn't getting out. The minority view was being misperceived as a majority view. Now, this had a variety of consequences, but one of the most important, I argue, was for Muslim American organizations themselves. And so this rise, this surge of anti-Muslim sentiment in the media, I argue in my book, created what I call a riptide, a reaction among mainstream Muslim organizations that served to further increase the profile of anti-Muslim organizations. This chart describes what types of messages mainstream Muslim groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, like the Muslim Public Affairs Council, were making in their messages. Now, you may not be able to read this. On the top, this large line, this is the number of press releases per day, and this is the period from 2001 to 2003. You can see it was very common for organizations to dispatch press releases that condemned anti-Muslim sentiment. These were things like hate crimes against Muslims, controversies about whether, for example, imams should be allowed to pray at an airport, and so on and so forth. And many, many organizations were understandably very critical of these types of issues. This lower line here shows all of the press releases that were picked up by the media that condemned anti-Muslim sentiment. Okay, so you can see the majority of their voice in the media was condemning anti-Muslim sentiment. And this tinier line here describes the number of press releases that condemned terrorism. So not anti-Muslim sentiment, but terrorism. Groups like Al-Qaeda, which was then the foremost terrorist organization, of course. And this tiny sliver, this tiny black sliver here, describes the number of press releases by mainstream Muslim organizations that received any media coverage. And so if you can imagine for a moment that you're an American with very little information about Islam, and you're confronted by a media that showed you a variety of very fearful and compelling messages that suggest Islam is in fact a dangerous religion, combined with an apparent absence of condemnation on the part of Muslim Americans themselves, instead, a group of people, Muslim Americans, who appeared more concerned about dispatching and discarding anti-Muslim sentiment than they were about condemning terrorism. And so I'll show you in a moment how this kind of helped this anti-Muslim narrative coalesce. Anti-Muslim organizations were able to accuse mainstream Muslim organizations of tacitly condoning terrorism because they never publicly, their message was not getting out, that they were unequivocally condemning terrorism by groups like Al-Qaeda. And at the same time, it lent credence to the idea that these groups were actually hiding behind a veil of political correctness. That is, that they were more concerned about criticizing anti-Muslim sentiment than they were about criticizing terrorism itself. Now, at the time, Muslim American leaders were enmeshed in very vexing debates about whether and how terrorism should be condemned. There was a very real concern that by condemning terrorism, you would somehow legitimate the idea that Islam has anything to do with terrorism. And so many organizations, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations, spent much more of their time, as this graph shows, condemning anti-Muslim sentiment rather than condemning terrorism. I'll come back to that theme a little later. And so here the analogy again is a riptide. So the more that mainstream Muslim American groups condemn anti-Muslim rhetoric, the further they get pulled out to sea, until we actually see a sea change of public discourse around Islam. That is, that attacking fire with fire, and that's, by the way, why so many of the anti-Muslim, so many of the condemnations of anti-Muslim sentiment got media attention because they were also very emotionally charged. People were extremely angry at people like Daniel Pipes, and that, of course, feeds the media frenzy. The media sees the back and forth of emotions and gravitates towards that. Meanwhile, condemnations of terrorism were much more intellectual and dispassionate. They liked to invoke geopolitics and kind of more intellectual reasoning, but lacked the tangible emotion that the media gravitates towards. And so I argue in the book that's one of the reasons they didn't get much media attention. Yet again, these condemnations of anti-Muslim sentiment fed the media fire, increased the profile of anti-Muslim organizations, and enabled them to achieve even more standing within the mass media. So as you can see, this is the first graph I showed you, which is at the after 9/11 environment. Here are organizations that produce anti-Muslim messages. Here's the vast majority of groups who are producing pro or moderately pro-Muslim messages. And between 2001 and 2003, and 2004 and 2006, you can see that the number of organizations producing anti-Muslim messages more than doubled. The color of these circles, by the way, describes the emotional valence of their message. It's a little bit hard to see on this screen. But you can see again that the emotional power down here of anti-Muslim groups was increasing as they grew in size. Okay, but at this point they still represent a minority of all groups battling or struggling to shape American public discourse about Islam. How did they become mainstream? How did we get to the point where they could raise $245 million and compel major political figures to express such vehemently anti-Muslim views? Well, here's one more year of data. So here's the plagiarism detection analysis for 2001 to 2003, 2004 to 2006, 2007 to 2008. And as you can see on the right side of the graph here, the number of organizations that are expressing an anti-Muslim narrative increases threefold. These ties, these kind of arcs between these organizations, describe organizations that share a board member. And so you can see that not only did they grow in size, but they also forged allegiances to powerful organizations outside of the field, such as the Republican Jewish Coalition, and other groups who would enable them to solidify their stature within the public sphere. And more importantly, would enable them to make weak ties to financiers, other political connections that would solidify their stature. So this graph describes several of the largest anti-Muslim organizations in the country at the time, and shows that their donations to contributions in US dollars here over this period from 2001 to 2011 again grew exponentially, even at the height of the financial crisis in 2008. And I argue in the book that the increased media profile of these organizations gave them the standing necessary to become visible, to become an organization that could be essentially donated to. And with this money, they began to further consolidate their capacity to define Islam within the American public sphere. So one of the ways they did this, I argue in the book, is to invent experts. Now, the very idea of a terrorism expert is a bit of an oxymoron. Terrorism is, by definition, arbitrary and indiscriminate. And of course, collecting data on terrorism is extremely difficult. And so even among academics, there's very little consensus about how and why terrorism happens. But there is an industry, a very well-funded industry of people who call themselves terrorism experts, many of whom have very little credentials to call themselves such. Many of whom don't even, for example, speak languages that are spoken in regions that are most afflicted by terrorism. And then there's also a variety of people who have the appearance of being Muslim, and therefore kind of get an additional level of credibility by, for example, the color of their skin or their accent, but are in fact not Muslim. So examples of these are folks from Lebanon and Palestine who became really high-profile media voices during this period, and published several bestseller books on the New York Times bestseller book list. So on the one hand, these organizations funded and propelled these so-called terrorism experts into a celebrity, which then, now again, picture yourself as the American public. You don't know much about Muslims. You've been exposed to this very scary message. Muslims themselves don't seem to be saying anything, and now people who look and sound like Muslims are telling you that Muslims are actually terrorists. So you can see how there's a kind of a confluence of events that really begins to cohere around this anti-Muslim narrative. So not only are they funding these types of folks to write books and to give talks and so on and so forth, but they're creating their own infrastructure for public outreach. This is an organization which translates media from primarily from the Middle East and North Africa, with the expressed aim of identifying hate speech in the Middle East. This is a scene from the equivalent of Sesame Street in Palestine, which the organization translated as "I will shoot the Jews." This is a woman who's talking to these two young children who have said, according to this translation, "I will shoot the Jews." And this went on to air at CNN, and one of the administrative assistants at CNN quickly realized that it had been mistranslated. It did not read, "I will shoot the Jews," it read, "The Jews are shooting us." This is an example of the type of manipulation that exists and is possible when you have such power to define the public conversation. They also funded major film, spent about $19 million on a film called Obsession, radical Islam's war against the West. This film, which has very scary sounding piano music at the beginning and very compelling cinematography, was distributed in every major U.S. newspaper in advance of in the run-up to the 2008 election. It draws analogies between radical Islam and Nazism. There's not a single kind of bona fide, in my view, mainstream Muslim leader who appears in the organization. Instead, again, there's a cadre of anti-Muslim groups alongside some of the so-called experts that I just mentioned, who again lend credence to the idea that the American public is being duped by mainstream Muslims. Okay, so by 2008, we've reached the position where anti-Muslim organizations are no longer part of the fringe. They're firmly part of the mainstream. They have lots of money, they have political connections, they have their own media infrastructure. And meanwhile, mainstream Muslim organizations have little media influence. They're involved in an excruciating debate about whether and how to respond to these anti-Muslim organizations. And as a result, they're really falling out of public view. Now this, I argue in the book, provided an opportunity for anti-Muslim organizations to attack the legitimacy of genuinely mainstream Muslim organizations. So now that you have the power to define what Islam is, you can also say who's mainstream and who's not. And so groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations are widely accused of, again, tacitly condoning or even encouraging terrorism. There's even an act of Congress which is designed to condemn the organization. The FBI breaks ties with the Council on American Islamic Relations, which was probably at the time the largest Muslim American advocacy group, or arguably the most representative. We don't have good data on that, it's fair to say. But it's at least one of the larger organizations. And then we see in the Senate hearings on the threat of domestic radicalization, led by Joe Lieberman, Susan Collins, and later Peter King, in which only one of the mainstream Muslim organizations that I analyze in my book appeared. And again, it probably wouldn't surprise you to know who else appeared. It was anti-Muslim organizations and people who call themselves terrorism experts, but whom I argue in my book have very little cause to call themselves such. And one of the other neat things about this plagiarism detection approach is that I can use it to compare the spread of anti-Sharia legislation. So one thing that happened around 2008 is some of the anti-Muslim organizations got together with some advocacy groups that design model legislation for policy and sent it to a bunch of legislators. And I got my hands on a copy of that model legislation. And then I used the plagiarism detection software to compare it to the legislation that was actually introduced in so many US states. Here you can see right here on the left, these are groups that introduced the legislation. And the number next to them represents the number of words in that text that were lifted verbatim from the anti-Sharia model legislation. And you can see in some cases, Mississippi, 82% of that language was lifted directly verbatim from the anti-Muslim organizations. Minnesota, similarly. Other groups were much lower. Kansas is only 2%. And as many of you may know, some of this legislation actually passed. It's still under review by higher courts. But the irony here, of course, is that, as many have argued, this is kind of a non-problem. Not only does the U.S. regularly allow religious jurisprudence in matters of arbitration, and nobody was ever trying to use Sharia to challenge the Constitution, nor would there be a legal mechanism for them to do so. And so really the idea that this campaign got so much traction was quite telling. Okay, but I've told you about the media, I've told you about our policies and our counterterrorism policies. What I haven't told you about is the regular public. So what did this do to the public? I've been speculating all along that it created an increase in anti-Muslim sentiment. And indeed, if we look at public opinion surveys from 2001 to 2003, we see, at first a blip. If I showed you the 2000 data, it would be right about here. So we see an increase. But then right around the time that anti-Muslim organizations are gaining traction, we see a steady increase in the percentage of Americans expressing negative views about Muslims. Now, I can't draw a perfect causal link between these two things, but I do think it's very telling that it occurs at the same time. One of the other neat things about this moment in computational social science and big data is that we can harvest data from Twitter and Facebook. So here, these are the percentage of tweets about a certain set of civil society organizations with positive sentiment. And you can see here that groups such as Act for America, which is one of the larger kind of grassroots organizations that currently does a lot of public lecturing around Islam or Stop the Islamization of America, have very strong support among Twitter users. Surely not a representative sample of the American public, but an increasingly important group of people who have come to define the media cycle itself. Twitter users, that is. Here we see from 2005 and 2007 to 2010 and 2012 the number of controversies about the expansion or construction of mosques or violent attacks upon mosques. And there's been an 800% increase between 2005, right around when anti-Muslim organizations were having their day in the media, and 2012. Really just marked, troubling increase. And again, no causal links can be drawn, but this does occur alongside campaigns from groups like Stop the Islamization of America, Act for America. These are grassroots organizations, one of which was responsible for the protest about the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, but also many of these other controversies. And then we saw a surge, of course, in famously Terry Koran, the so-called Quran burning affair, and the Innocence of Muslims, the kind of sophomoric film that made a variety of slanderous statements about Islam. Now, thankfully, some of my work is starting to get out there, as Dr. Safi mentioned, to try to right this wrong, to try to correct the misperception that Muslim American groups actually don't condemn terrorism, and to call attention to the fact that anti-Muslim organizations are having an exaggerated stature in this debate. Surprisingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, the anti-Muslim organizations aren't so happy with that. They are happy that they're winning, though. Negative messages about Muslims are increasing in the media, even the left-wing media, which is something I find in the work. So this isn't just a story about Fox News, it's a story about the New York Times, CBS, and so on, which relies upon some of the same sources that I've been discussing today. And they also don't like my book very much. This is the first review of my book on Amazon. Islam's sympathetic narrative, oh well. So what can we do, and what can be done? Well, the first and most disturbing thing I think we need to think about is the potential for these ideas to travel abroad. We saw evidence earlier, say with the Quran burning affair, groups like the Taliban, condemning Americans and Obama and using that as fodder for recruitment. But it wasn't until recently that we saw evidence that anti-Muslim sentiment was directly being used for recruitment by terrorism organizations like this. So here, the leader of Al-Shabaab, one of the leaders of Al-Shabaab, using Trump's call to ban all Muslims as evidence that there is no gray zone, right? That you either need to join ISIS or leave, right? And now you can't leave, according to this narrative. So this is the danger. And we've seen this before. We've seen this with the Quran burning affair. We've seen this with the sophomoric film, The Innocence of Muslims. The danger that these fringe ideas can do when they travel abroad is tangible. They not only upset people, quite understandably, but they contribute to the misperception that there's some kind of conspiracy among the US government to be anti-Muslim. And I think this is probably the most dangerous threat we face now. Others will speculate, of course, that the rise in anti-Muslim sentiment also creates the potential for increased radicalization to the extent that young people feel that they can't belong in a society where a majority of people have negative sentiment towards them. We haven't seen evidence of that yet, but I think the potential is plausible. So what can we do? We're not going to fix the emotional bias of the mass media. Tomorrow we're not going to go out, despite many well-intentioned attempts by a variety of mainstream Muslim leaders. Dr. Safi actually is one of my favorite examples of someone who's really got the language and the technique for talking to the media down. It's no easy thing. But we're not going to convince Fox News to stop amplifying emotional concerns about terrorism. We're not. We can, however, begin to decide how to pick our battles. And I think the one message from my book that I'd like to resonate in the public is that if we put all our attention against people like Trump, if we fight fire with fire, we're going to burn everything down. And instead, I think we need new messages that refocus the public conversation around something that I know, having talked to so many mainstream Muslim organizations, which is that Muslim Americans unequivocally condemn terrorism in all its forms, and they're furious at groups like ISIS. They're terrified by groups like ISIS. And yet they haven't shown in the public sphere that genuine anger and fear that we know from sociology and social psychology bonds groups together, that is corrective against and preventative against outgroup bias. I think we need to capture some of that emotional energy, channel it towards the media, and see if that can right these wrongs. Thank you.
So we have our podium set up. If anyone in the audience has questions, please come forward.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the presentation. Sure. I was eagerly awaiting the last parts of the presentation, which is basically, okay, fine, now what? And I candidly would like to hear a more aggressive approach to taking control of the dialogue than we have seen so far. And I'm certainly not faulting you as an academic for the person who should take that lead, although you're the guy with the data, you're the guy with the ideas, and you at this moment have more of a pulpit than most. And additionally, candidly, since you're not a Muslim, I think you're in a slightly better position of speaking for the great unwashed, for those who don't know they've ever met a Muslim. So your response to that?
Yeah, I certainly, I agree. I think all of us, especially those of us in the academy, need to be more vocal when working on these issues. I've tried, I've written for the Washington Post. I've done various interviews, but I can say all day that Muslims unequivocally condemn terrorism, and as someone who's not Muslim, I have very little legitimacy apart from the data, which is important, but it's not as compelling, I think, as the kind of genuine emotional fear and anger that I've seen from talking to mainstream Muslim leaders, who I think are understandably concerned that there's a kind of media motif of an angry Muslim, right? That if you go on Fox News and become angry, you only serve to further the stereotype about angry Muslims, right? But there's anger that's just anger about attacks on your religion, and then there's anger that I think is equally genuine, that is towards groups like ISIS or Daesh, and that needs to come out. And I think there's been a lot of understandable hesitation about whether that's a good idea. But I think given what I've shown you today, the time is gone for that type of corrective discourse, right? A majority of Americans now has this conspiracy theory in their heads. And so you can't simply throw facts at the problem. In fact, some recent research coming out of political science and social psychology shows that the more facts you throw at people who believe in a conspiracy theory, the more they double down. It actually exacerbates the spread of rumors. So I certainly will do my part here in any opportunity I get. But I also think Muslim Americans themselves could benefit from more vociferously and emotionally condemning the groups that have slandered and terrorized their religion.
I mean, my own observation is that Islam, as I see it in America from a very, very limited exposure on my own part, is not the same thing as radical people who happen to be Muslims elsewhere in the world. And that's a distinction which I don't believe I've seen enough of. I don't think I have seen enough full-page ads in the Times, in the USA Today, and wherever else it might be, coming from people who I think reasonably would represent mainstream American Islam and say, hey, we agree with you, these guys are nuts, or words to that effect.
Sure.
And that's frankly, from my opinion, is a call to arms, and using a miserable analogy, but if we had done the same thing, for example, with handguns in the United States 50 or 100 years ago, we would now not be facing a contagion. And I think this is the kind of thing which needs to be caught earlier rather than later.
Sure. I agree. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that Muslim Americans are an extraordinarily diverse group. And so for us to assume that the group can kind of come together with one single voice and have, when they represent, the full spectrum of political ideologies. Muslims, by the way, voted 3-1 for President Bush in 2000, right? Speak, dozens of languages, come from dozens of different countries. And, for a long time enjoyed status as a kind of model minority in the United States. Now, we had blips. We had the Iran hostage crisis, which I read about in the book. But by and large, Muslim Americans were either a model minority or an invisible minority. And then seemingly overnight, all that changed. And so I think for us to assume that they can, Muslim American organizations can come together overnight is unreasonable. But by now,
we've had reviled minorities in this country who have managed to seize control of the public discourse successfully.
Sure.
I don't have to announce the names of those organizations representing fringe populations that have turned the dialogue around.
Sure.
It's not an impossibility.
And in fact, interestingly, some of the mainstream Muslim organizations use Jewish organizations as a model. Use groups like the Anti-Defamation League as models for how to do this. Yeah. So you're right.
Sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Hey, Chris.
Hi. How you doing?
As a cultural sociologist, I want to stretch you into Europe, Eastern and Western Europe. I'm reading a book now called Hunting Season, which is about the capture and killing of the reporter by ISIS. The capture apparently occurred before at least we had ever heard of ISIS. The killing occurred later. This notion of mainstream as it relates to European folks, I'm really stunned, and maybe shouldn't be, by the number of folks who now see ISIS as a mainstream organization and yet are of European heritage. Any insights on that? Because clearly you talked about we need to do something now. I'm wondering if it's not too late, but it's already happening.
Sure. Yeah. I do know something about Europe. I've done studies in Britain, for example. Know the Muslim population in Britain and France fairly well. There's some major differences. The population has been more visible for much longer. So for example, in Britain, debates about Islam and accommodation of Islam go back to the Salman Rushdie affair, or debates about the public slaughter of animals in public spaces. Also, the type of Muslims who migrated to Britain were by and large, much less well educated, had lower incomes, and are much more segregated than U.S. Muslims. And the result was, I think, kind of a much more politically charged situation until recently. Now, I think we're headed in that direction. But historically, Britain has been having this debate for a very long time. And so I think the idea that Europe's own attempts to integrate Muslims are failing and are creating radicalization is plausible. Once again, what can be done about it and how it can be used to stop ISIS is another huge $1 million question. I think on the one hand, we thought for a while that countries like France, which famously unite around the principles of republicanism and offer citizenship to anyone who's born in France. Of course, today we learned of attempts to remove that right for people accused of terrorism. So even France, the paragon of this model of integration, which is that anybody can be French, is now disappearing. And we saw how vividly in Paris how that has gone awry. So I think I think we don't know a lot about ISIS, right? We're not experts. We don't have data on who goes to. There are some studies of political scientists have done that look at kind of return rates and who goes to Syria, for example. But we really we're at a different moment now than we were 10 years ago. I mean, ISIS is a real threat. I mean, I don't think I think it's worth reminding ourselves of that even if these are people who many of us believe are not Muslim and who are slandering the religion, they now, there's also a question worth asking, which is, well, if they call themselves Muslims, who are we to say that they're not? If lots of people unite around that, right? You can't simply say, well, and this again speaks to the previous question about, who gets to speak on behalf of Muslims, right? No one gets to speak on behalf of all Muslims, precisely because of the diversity of the religion. So I think it's a dangerous, it's a dangerous organization, terrifying, no doubt. Could European integration policies be modified to help fix this problem? I think so, but these groups that I've observed in the U.S. have many transnational ties in Britain and elsewhere. So, for example, Geert Wilders, the famous Dutch politician, who is famously banned from Britain, banned from entering Britain for incitement to religious hatred towards Muslims. He's a regular guest on many of these lecture circuits that I've described by anti-Muslim organizations. And again, this debate has been going on in places like Britain for much longer. And so, how you fix that and how you rebuff that kind of xenophobia, there's I'm not aware of any kind of magical solution. But again, I do think from European colleagues, I've heard that similar processes are at play in Europe. And so perhaps the solution could be similar in Europe, which is to say that, French Muslims and British Muslims need to, more forcefully condemn terrorism in an emotional manner to, again, benefit from that solidarity that's created by shared emotions like fear.
Well, the line's not too long. Let's step right up.
I'm thinking of a couple of books I've read by Muslim women. Shiri, I can't think of her last name, E-R-I-R-I. Anyhow, she was a part of the Dutch Parliament for a while, moved to the United States, works for American Enterprise. These books, at least these two authors I'm thinking of, very vividly describe what it's like for women in Islamic countries. Genital mutilation, all that. It's really, really tough to read. And I think there's sort of an underground group of women that are tuning into this and then extrapolate to Islam broadly. And I think that has not been, at least I'm not aware of it's being countered, or even how it could be countered. I wonder if you have a comment.
You mean the attacks against women by...
Right, how harshly Islam, in their experience, treats women.
Well, I mean, I should say I'm not an expert in Muslim Islam abroad. I am aware, of many, cases, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, where there's clear evidence of discrimination against women. It's also worth noting, as many have argued, that many of the heads of state in the world are Muslim women. I mean, that's an amazing feat that we ourselves haven't accomplished. So we could have a conversation about the accommodation of gender. But certainly, one hears of these egregious, particularly among ISIS now. Like some of the things that the recent New York Times expose on women and how they're treated by ISIS is just terrifying. I think it's also so I can't really speak to how real that threat is. I can, however, say that many of the most promising Muslim American leaders are women. So people like Ingrid Mattson, the former leader of the Islamic Society of North America, Debbie Almontaser. There's really dozens of people who are leading advocacy groups, civil society organizations. Some of the best and brightest minds are Muslim American women. So if anybody can fight that fight, it's these folks. Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you all for coming. As Chris mentioned, actually Ingrid Mattson is going to be coming to campus in about a month. So if you're interested, look us up at Disc Islam. I don't remember what the Twitter handle is. Shoot, I'm sorry. Islamic at Duke, and we tweet about all of these events, as well as islamicstudies.duke.edu. If you have any more questions, please let Dr. Bale or myself know. But thank you all for coming. Next week we're here again. So have a good day.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up tomorrow morning, Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein